Ian's going on to talk about how you chase those assets.
I will try to be very, very quick doing this. As night follows day, almost certainly assets will have disappeared or will have gone to abroad, will have gone to some foreign jurisdiction. And at the outset, in the first 24 hours, as we heard from Ben at the start, it's very important to actually consider at that particular point, where are the assets, where have they gone, where are they likely to be. Now in this case, in this particular example, we've obviously got a Qatari company, Qatari individuals. We already have been tipped off by a whistleblower that there are assets that have gone offshore. Now, typical likely candidates, Switzerland, Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, Turks and Caicos, St. Kitts, BVI, Cayman, there are many jurisdictions where assets can go. The one jurisdiction which I've had most difficulty with is Andorra, of all places. We found it almost impossible to get any information out of Andorra, primarily because it's very difficult getting any solicitor to work with you in Andorra, because they're all conflicted, because they act for the banks out there in any event, and there's obviously this big rivalry between the French and the Spanish who have stakes in Andorra. But that was one jurisdiction where we found it very, very tricky in getting any information out of that particular jurisdiction. So it's considering at the outset, where are the assets, what are the likely jurisdictions, and in so doing you've also got to consider the legal or the practice of law in those particular jurisdictions. Now in the UK we have relief, for example, has been expressed by John, worldwide freezing injunctions. Now that is a relief in personam. What do I mean by that? But in effect, it is a relief against the individual. It's a relief stopping the individual from dealing with assets. It's not necessarily attaching against the assets themselves. Now in many foreign jurisdictions, especially many continental jurisdictions, which have a civil law background rather than a common law background, they don't have that same concept of in personam. Their relief relates to an attachment of the assets themselves, not in effect an attachment against the individual, but the assets themselves. And that is very important when you're actually working out the strategy at the outset, because rather than identifying the individual, at that point you're trying to identify where the assets are and what those assets are. So it's very important to consider the differences between civil law jurisdictions and common law jurisdictions. And in that respect, it's very, very important to choose local lawyers who are adept and skilled in this particular area. Now, that isn't necessarily going to be easy to find, because as I say, in some jurisdictions it's very difficult finding a lawyer who's not conflicted in some way. Switzerland, for example, there are many excellent lawyers, and whether it's Geneva, Zurich, or wherever, you generally can find someone who would be able to assist you, who've done this day in, day out. Other jurisdictions, as I say, more difficult to find, but it's very, very important that you find the right local lawyer. And similarly, local investigators. At the outset of this particular project, this particular investigation, it's very, very important to have the right team in place, the right forensic accountants involved, and the right private investigators involved, whether that's in this jurisdiction or abroad, because you really do rely on them finding the assets in many respects, looking through the documentation, looking at patterns. Where has the individual gone on holiday in the past? Where are his bank accounts? Etc, etc, etc. It's really the investigators who generally find out this type of information, and therefore it's very important actually having the right team at the outset. The other thing to bear in mind is, in our jurisdiction, you can often get information by way of court orders requiring banks to provide information regarding bank accounts. In certain jurisdictions, that is not as easy as it may seem in this jurisdiction. In this jurisdiction you have Norwich Pharmacal orders against, which are orders against third parties requiring them to give information. The Bankers Book Evidence Act, again, it's legislation that can be used in relation to bank statements. In certain jurisdictions, for example, again referring to Switzerland, it's a criminal offence for banks to disclose information. and the banks themselves can be criminally convicted for providing information. Now, there is a way around that in certain jurisdictions, including Switzerland, where you can start criminal proceedings in that jurisdiction and enforce and compel the banks to provide information as a part of those criminal proceedings. But in many jurisdictions, it's going to be very difficult to get bank statements and information relating to bank accounts, and bear that in mind again at the outset of the investigation. Prepare the English proceedings at the outset mindful of where you may have to take that order or that relief. Think about which jurisdictions you're going to have to try to enforce the freezing injunction or other forms of relief. Have that at the forefront of your mind, because although the very nature of worldwide freezing injunction is that it is a worldwide restraint on an individual from dealing with his assets or her assets, that doesn't mean that that will be necessarily enforced in a jurisdiction, wherever that jurisdiction may be outside England and Wales. On that basis, you may need to go overseas and enforce your UK order, your English order, in a court, in a foreign court, and therefore it's very, very important that at the outset you appreciate what you will need to prove in those courts in order to enforce the freezing injunction or whatever form of relief you're trying to seek in that particular jurisdiction. And then just finally, passports. Always bear in mind that an individual may well have 3, 4, 5 passports, who knows. It's often useful at the outset to also seek an order to require the individual to deliver up his passports or her passports either to the court or to the solicitors acting on the other side. Many instances where individuals, respondents, have flown the nest and have managed to take assets with them because they've been using passports that we may not have known about. So it may not be necessarily the fail-safe route to get them to deliver up the passports. They may have extra supplemental passports, but it's something you should be considering at the outset. Just this particular example, just a few anecdotes. I had a case very similar to this quite recently, but it was Dubai rather than Qatar. And the individual was a fraudster in a telecoms company in Dubai, but which had interests all around the world basically. And the telltale sign was this individual had and it seems to be prevalent amongst oligarchs and Middle Eastern individuals. He'd invested the ill-gotten gains of his crime in trying to acquire a football club in Cheshire. Not a very good football club in Cheshire, but had invested a significant amount in trying to acquire that club and basically lording it over the other directors and individuals as a almost like an Al Fayed Fulham example of being sort of gentrified in the UK. But again, with the help of some private investigators, we discovered by putting the dots together and finding out that this individual had invested in this particular football club, and we managed to freeze the assets in effect. Just one other anecdote, the Anton Pillar order that John mentioned, it can take you to some very, very peculiar places, some very peculiar instances. I remember doing one fairly recently where it was an old rectory, and I was invited in effect to go up into the loft. I was warned though that they hadn't been up in that loft for some time and that they did have a bad case of bats. So you ended up crawling into the loft, which was absolutely caked with bat droppings and several bats flying around your head just looking for boxes and documentation. But as the supervising solicitor in that particular Anton Pillar, you had to go up there, which wasn't a very pleasant task. And I know one of my colleagues also found some very, very, I wouldn't say incriminating evidence when doing a supervising solicitor role, but he did find some very strange bondage material in someone's wardrobe, which I think they would rather not had exposed at that time. But you do see some very interesting things in this particular job. Thanks very much.